What could possibly compel a wealthy, carefree young man to give up everything he owns and embrace a life of complete poverty for the love of Christ? The story of Saint Francis of Assisi reveals to us that when the human heart truly encounters divine love, it's capable of the most extraordinary transformations. John Bernardone, known as Francis, was born in the prosperous city of Assisi around the year 1182 into a family of textile merchants. His life would change radically, transforming him into one of the most beloved and venerated saints of the Catholic Church, the founder of the Franciscan order, and a timeless example of radical devotion to Jesus Christ. Chapter 1. The Early Years. Francis was born in a time of great prosperity for the city of Assisi. His father, Peter Bernardone, was a thriving cloth merchant who frequently traveled to France for business, and his mother, Mary Pica, came from a noble French family. The nickname Francis was given to him precisely because of his father's love for France and the business he conducted there. From a young age, the future saint displayed a cheerful and generous personality, although he was also inclined toward the worldly pleasures that his social position allowed during his youth. Francis intensely enjoyed the pleasures that his family's wealth provided. He dressed in the finest fabrics, organized lavish feasts, and was considered the natural leader of the young nobles of Assisi. His magnanimous character led him to be extremely generous with his friends, spending his father's money without measure on banquets and amusements. Chroniclers of the time describe a young man full of life, a lover of music and poetry, who dreamed of achieving military glory like so many knights of his time. Francis's education was meticulous by the standards of the time. He learned Latin at St. George's School, although he never fully mastered it, and from an early age he was introduced to the family business. However, his heart did not seem to be completely satisfied with the prospects offered to him. There was a deep unease within him, a search for something greater than riches and earthly longings, although he didn't yet know how to pinpoint exactly what his soul longed for. The religious atmosphere of the time was complex. The church was going through a period of renewal, but also of some worldliness in certain sectors. Francis grew up in a Catholic family, but his religious practice was typical of a young bourgeois, formal, without great personal commitment. He participated in the main liturgical celebrations and knew the basic prayers, but his spiritual life had not yet awakened. Divine providence, however, already had special plans for this young man who seemed destined only to continue his father's business. The transition from adolescence to youth marked the beginning of a stage for Francis, where worldly pleasures intensified, but also where the first spiritual concerns began to manifest. His biographers recount that even in the midst of the happiest parties, Francis experienced moments of inexplicable melancholy, as if his heart sensed that he was called to something completely different from what he had known until then. These were the years of divine preparation, where God allowed the future saint to fully experience the vanities of the world, so that he could later renounce them with full knowledge. Chapter 2. Christ's Calling. The year 1202 marked a turning point in Francis's life, when he decided to participate in the war between Assisi and Perugia. Filled with chivalrous ideals and thirsty for military glory, he enlisted with great enthusiasm, dreaming of becoming a noble warrior. However, the reality of the war proved very different from his romantic dreams. Francis was taken prisoner and spent an entire year in the prisons of Perugia, a time that Providence used to begin his inner purification. During this period of captivity, he began to experience the first moments of deep reflection on the meaning of his life. Upon returning to Assisi after being released, Francis became seriously ill. This illness was another instrument that God used to prepare his heart. During the long months of convalescence, The young man who was once pure joy and vitality was forced to face the fragility of human existence. The pleasures that once filled him began to seem empty and meaningless. His friends noticed a profound change in him. He no longer participated with the same enthusiasm in the parties, and he was often seen absorbed in thoughts that seemed to take him far away from the worldly concerns of his companions. It was during this time of inner searching that the encounter occurred that would definitively change his life. While praying in the small church of St. Damian's, which was in ruins on the outskirts of Assisi, Francis heard a voice 3 times that came from the Byzantine crucifix. "Go, Francis, and repair my house which, as you can see, is all in ruins." This extraordinary moment of divine communication filled his heart with reverential fear, but also with an indescribable joy. Christ himself had spoken to him, had entrusted him with a specific mission. Initially, Francis interpreted these words literally. He thought he should materially restore the Church of St. Damian's, and he devoted himself fervently to this task. He sold part of his father's merchandise and offered the money to the priest of St. Damian's for the restoration of the temple. However, the elderly priest, knowing the young man's impulsive character and fearing the reaction of Peter Bernardone, refused to accept the money. Francis then threw the coins on a window of the church and stayed with the priest, thus beginning his process of definitive separation from the world. The experience of St. Damian's was not an isolated event, but the beginning of a series of mystical encounters that defined Francis's vocation. He began to seek solitary places to pray, especially caves and forests where he could be alone with God. In these retreats, he experienced extraordinary spiritual consolations, but also periods of dryness that purified his soul of all earthly attachment. His contemporaries began to consider him a bit eccentric, but Francis had already begun a path of no return towards holiness. The voice of Christ in St. Damian's had awakened in him an insatiable thirst for God that nothing in this world could ever satisfy. Chapter 3. Renunciation of the World. Peter Bernadone's reaction to his son's behavior was not long in coming. Upon discovering that Francis had sold goods to restore St. Damian's, Peter flew into a rage, demanding his immediate return home to dedicate himself to the family business. The tension between father and son intensified as Francis refused to abandon his newfound way of life. Peter, a practical man deeply concerned about his family's financial future, couldn't comprehend his son's spiritual transformation. He viewed it as a temporary madness, something to be corrected by any means necessary. The situation reached a critical point when Peter decided to bring the matter before the civil court of Assisi. He accused Francis of squandering the family fortune and demanded he relinquish all rights to his inheritance. However, Francis surprised everyone by declaring that, having chosen to serve God, he was no longer subject to human but ecclesiastical justice. He requested the case be transferred to the Bishop of Assisi, Bishop Guido, who agreed to intervene in this delicate family matter. The day of the trial before the bishop marked one of the most dramatic and symbolic moments in the life of St. Francis. The entire city gathered to witness the showdown between Peter Bernardone and his son. Bishop Guido, a wise and prudent man, urged Francis to return the money he had taken without his father's permission, explaining that God cannot build his work on ill-gotten gains. Francis immediately accepted the prelate's suggestion, but his response exceeded all expectations. In a gesture forever etched in the memory of those who witnessed it, Francis not only returned the money, but completely stripped himself of his clothes before the entire crowd. He placed them at his father's feet and uttered these words that would forever seal his break with the world. "Listen, Father, and listen all. Until now I have called Peter Bernardone my father, but having decided to serve God, I return to him the money that angers him so. and all the clothes that are his. From now on, I will say, Our Father who art in heaven, and not Peter Bernardone. Bishop Guido, deeply moved by this act of total self-renunciation, immediately covered Francis with his episcopal mantle, a gesture symbolizing the Church's protection over the young man who had abandoned everything to follow Christ. The crowd was divided. Some considered Francis a madman, having lost his mind, while others began to sense they were witnessing the birth of a saint. Peter Bernardone collected his son's clothes with tears of grief and disappointment, returning home having lost not only the hopes he had placed in his firstborn, but also the son he had so loved. Francis, meanwhile, retreated naked but free, having definitively cut all ties that bound him to the world and its earthly riches. Just as Saint Francis stripped himself of all worldly possessions and stood naked before the bishop to proclaim his complete devotion to the Heavenly Father, the great mystics of our faith discovered secret pathways to experiencing God's miraculous power in their lives. Saint Teresa of Avila, Doctor of the Church, documented 7 spiritual keys that transformed her relationship with the divine, practices that opened the floodgates of heaven's graces and led to extraordinary miracles in her life and those around her. If St. Francis's radical abandonment to divine providence has touched your heart, discover how St. Teresa's 7 secret keys can deepen your prayer life and unlock the miraculous in your own spiritual journey. The 7 secret keys of St. Teresa to achieve miracles is available in the first pinned comment and QR code, but only for a limited time. Chapter 4. The First Companions. After his dramatic disrobing before his father, Francis withdrew to live a life of complete poverty and prayer. He initially sought refuge in a Benedictine monastery near Assisi, where he worked as a servant in exchange for a bit of food. He wore a rough habit received from charity and lived a life of extreme penance, dedicating long hours to prayer and caring for the lepers who were numerous around the city. His example began to attract the attention of some citizens, although most still considered him an eccentric who had lost his marbles. The first person drawn to Francis's example was Bernard of Quintaval, a wealthy merchant from Assisi who had been a childhood friend of the saint. For several months, Bernard observed Francis's transformation and was deeply impressed by his supernatural joy and inner peace, which starkly contrasted with the life of privation he had chosen. One night, Bernard invited Francis to stay at his home, secretly intending to observe his behavior during his rest. To his surprise, he discovered Francis spent the entire night in prayer, constantly repeating, "My God and all things." This experience definitively convinced Bernard that Francis had found the true treasure of spiritual life. The next morning, he expressed his desire to abandon his riches and follow the same path of evangelical poverty. Francis, overjoyed to have his first companion in this new way of life, suggested they consult divine providence by opening the Book of Gospels 3 times. The passages they found were decisive. "If you want to be perfect, go, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. Take nothing for the journey, and if anyone wants to come after me, deny themselves." Bernard interpreted these words as a clear confirmation of his calling. Shortly thereafter, they were joined by Peter Catani, a canon of the Assisi Cathedral who had witnessed Francis's conversion. Peter was a cultured and respected man in the city, so his decision to follow the madman of Assisi caused quite a stir. The third companion was Giles, a simple and pious peasant who came to Francis asking to be admitted into his brotherhood. With these first 3 followers, Francis began to sense that God had bigger plans for the small community forming around him. The first 4 Franciscans established their residence at the Porciuncola, a small chapel dedicated to St. Mary of the Angels that the Benedictine monks of Mount Subasio had ceded to Francis. This place would become the heart of the future Franciscan order. There they lived in extreme poverty, working with their hands during the day and dedicating the nighttime hours to prayer. Their joy was so evident that people began to change their minds about Francis, and some began to see in him not a madman, but a man truly in love with God. The seed of what would become one of the most important religious orders in history had begun to germinate in the humble hearts of these first brothers who had left everything to follow in the footsteps of Christ, poor and crucified. Chapter 5. The founding of the Franciscan order. As the number of Francis's followers grew, the need to establish a rule of life that could be approved by ecclesiastical authority became evident. In 1209, when there were already 11 brothers, Francis decided it was time to request papal approval for their way of life. The decision wasn't taken lightly. St. Francis was keenly aware of the importance of always remaining in perfect obedience to the Holy Catholic Church, believing that any genuine spiritual gift had to be recognized and blessed by Christ's vicar on earth. The first version of the Franciscan rule was extraordinarily simple, consisting mainly of a compilation of gospel quotes expressing the ideal life St. Francis and his companions had chosen. The central core of this primitive rule rested on three fundamental pillars: absolute poverty, both personal and communal; perfect chastity, lived as total consecration to God; and obedience, not only to religious superiors, but especially to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. St. Francis considered these three evangelical vows the indispensable foundation for anyone desiring to perfectly follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ. The journey to Rome to request pontifical approval was an adventure filled with faith and trust in divine providence. St. Francis and his brothers set out for the Eternal City without money, relying solely on Christian charity for their sustenance along the way. Upon arriving in Rome, they faced the enormous bureaucratic hurdles of the papal curia, and it seemed almost impossible that a group of poor, uninfluential men could obtain an audience with the Holy Father. However, Providence arranged for Cardinal John of St. Paul, who had met St. Francis during his travels through Umbria, to intercede on their behalf. The meeting with Pope Innocent III was preceded by a prophetic dream the pontiff had. In this nighttime vision, the Pope saw the Basilica of St. John Lateran, a symbol of the universal church, teetering dangerously and on the verge of collapse, but a small, poor man was holding it up with his own shoulders. The next day, when St. Francis was presented to him, Innocent III immediately recognized the figure from his dream and understood that God was sending him this providential instrument for the renewal of his church. The oral approval of the Franciscan rule by Pope Innocent III on April 16, 1209, officially marked the birth of the Order of Friars Minor. The pontiff not only approved the way of life proposed by St. Francis, but also conferred clerical tonsure upon him and his companions, authorizing them to preach penance in every place they were welcomed. This papal approval represented a moment of immense joy for St. Francis, who saw in it the definitive confirmation that his vocation truly came from God. Upon returning to Assisi, the brothers settled permanently at the Porziuncola, from where the extraordinary expansion of the order would begin, and within a few years would spread throughout Europe and reach the Holy Land. Chapter 6. The meeting with St. Clare. In the spring of 1212, when St. Francis was already known throughout the Umbria region for his preaching and his evangelical lifestyle, a young noblewoman from Assisi began to feel profoundly drawn to his message of conversion and radical following of Christ. Clare Fairgood, belonging to one of the city's most distinguished families, had heard St. Francis's sermons in the Cathedral of St. Rufinus and had been captivated by his call to penance and the stripping away of worldly riches. Although she was barely 18 years old, Claire demonstrated from the very first moment an extraordinary spiritual maturity and an unwavering determination to consecrate her life completely to God. The encounters between St. Francis and Claire were always characterized by the strictest observance of the norms of Christian prudence. The conversations took place in the presence of other brothers and focused exclusively on spiritual topics. St. Francis immediately recognized in Claire a soul especially chosen by God, endowed with a keen intelligence and a generous heart, capable of the greatest sacrifices for love of the Lord. Claire, for her part, found in St. Francis the spiritual director she had been asking God for in her prayers, someone capable of guiding her along the path of evangelical perfection that her soul burned to tread. Claire's decision to abandon the world was not taken hastily, but after long months of prayer, reflection, and spiritual consultation. Her family, upon learning of her intentions, opposed it vehemently because they had planned for her an advantageous marriage that would consolidate the social position of the lineage. However, Claire had already made an irrevocable decision. On the night of Palm Sunday in 1212, taking advantage of the fact that the whole family was asleep, she secretly escaped from her house and went to the Porziuncola, where St. Francis and the brothers were waiting for her with lit torches for the ceremony of her religious consecration. The ceremony took place in the small chapel of St. Mary of the Angels, in an atmosphere of profound prayer and recollection. St. Francis personally cut Claire's hair as a symbol of her definitive renunciation of the world, and she received the habit of penance, thus becoming the first woman to officially embrace the Franciscan way of life. Immediately afterward, for reasons of prudence and to protect her from the possible violent reactions of her family, St. Francis led her to the Benedictine monastery of St. Paul of the Abbesses, where Claire remained until an appropriate house could be established for her and the future companions who wanted to follow her example. The founding of the monastery of St. Damian's marked the beginning of the Second Franciscan order, known as the Poor Clares. Claire settled definitively in this church that St. Francis had restored years before, and which now became the first convent of Franciscan nuns. Very soon, she was joined by her sister Agnes and other young noblewomen from Assisi, forming a community that lived according to the same ideals of absolute poverty that characterized the Friars Minor. The spiritual friendship between St. Francis and Claire endured until the saint's death, always remaining within the limits of the most perfect chastity and mutually serving as encouragement to reach the heights of holiness. Claire would become the faithful guardian of the female Franciscan charism and would be canonized a few years after her death, being venerated as one of the greatest saints in the history of the Church. Chapter 7. The Missions and Evangelization. St. Francis's missionary heart manifested itself very early on in his ardent desire to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. As early as 1212, just 3 years after founding his order, John attempted to set sail for the Holy Land to preach among the Muslims, but a terrible storm forced him back to the Italian coast. This initial setback didn't dampen his evangelistic zeal. Instead, it drove him to intensify his spiritual preparation for a future mission in pagan lands. St. Francis considered martyrdom the perfect crown for a life entirely devoted to Jesus Christ, and he dreamed of shedding his blood for his faith as the ultimate testament of divine love. In 1214, St. Francis embarked on a second missionary journey, this time heading towards Morocco via Spain. His intent was to preach to the Almohad Sultan and, if God so willed it, achieve the martyr's palm. However, upon reaching Spanish territory, a severe illness confined him to bed, preventing him from continuing his journey. Saint Francis interpreted this new adversity as a sign of divine providence, indicating that the moment for his ultimate witness had not yet arrived. He then returned to Italy, where he dedicated himself with renewed fervor to preaching and governing his order, which was growing daily with new vocations from all walks of life. Finally, in 1219, St. Francis fulfilled his missionary dream when he set sail for Egypt, accompanying the Christian Crusaders. However, his approach to evangelization was radically different from the warrior spirit of the Crusades. While the Christian armies fought against the Muslims, St. Francis preached peace and brotherly love, even toward his enemies. His presence in the Crusader camp caused some bewilderment, as many did not understand how a religious man could speak of love for those they considered infidels, who should be fought with weapons. The culminating moment of this missionary expedition was St. Francis's extraordinary encounter with Sultan Malik al-Kamil, unarmed and relying solely on divine protection. St. Francis crossed the battle lines and requested to be brought before the Muslim ruler. The Sultan, intrigued by the courage of this Christian religious figure who presented himself without escort or gifts, agreed to receive him in private audience. For several days, St. Francis expounded upon the foundations of the Christian faith before Malik al-Kamil with such simplicity and conviction that the Sultan was deeply impressed by the sincerity and holiness of the Italian religious figure. Although St. Francis did not convert the Sultan to Christianity, he achieved something even more important. He demonstrated that respectful dialogue between representatives of different religions was possible, when it is guided by authentic charity and a sincere search for the truth. The Sultan showered St. Francis with honors and allowed him to freely visit the holy places of Jerusalem, an extraordinary privilege that very few Christians could obtain at that time. This encounter became a model of peaceful evangelization that profoundly influenced later Franciscan spirituality. St. Francis returned to Italy in 1220, bringing with him not only invaluable missionary experiences, but also a deeper understanding of how Christian love can build bridges, even in the most difficult circumstances. Chapter 8. The Stigmata of the Lord. In September of 1224, St. Francis withdrew to Mount Alverna in Tuscany to spend 40 days in fasting and prayer, in preparation for the feast of St. Michael the Archangel. This spiritual retreat, which had begun as an ordinary Lenten penance, would become the setting for the most extraordinary miracle of his life, the impression of the sacred wounds of the crucified Jesus Christ on his own body. St. Francis ascended the mountain accompanied only by Brother Leo, his confessor and closest companion, who would be a privileged witness to the prodigy that was about to occur. During the first days of the retreat, St. Francis experienced extraordinary spiritual consolations, alternating with periods of intense dryness and inner aridity. His prayers focused obsessively on two fundamental petitions that he constantly repeated before the crucifix: to know as fully as possible the sufferings that Jesus Christ had endured during his passion, and to experience in his own human heart the infinite love that had led the Son of God to sacrifice himself for the salvation of humanity. These supplications, which sprang from the depths of his enamored soul, were heard by God in a way that surpassed all human expectations. On the morning of September 14th, the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross, St. Francis was absorbed in prayer, contemplating the mysteries of the Passion of the Lord, when he saw a six-winged seraph descending from heaven, carrying between them the image of a crucified man. Brother Leo, who was praying at a distance, witnessed the supernatural radiance that enveloped the entire mountain during the vision. St. Francis was completely ecstatic at this apparition, simultaneously experiencing indescribable joy at the beauty of the seraph, and the most profound sadness at contemplating Jesus Christ crucified between its wings. When the vision disappeared, St. Francis discovered with amazement that he bore the sacred wounds of the Redeemer, imprinted on his body. Wounds appeared in his hands and feet that completely pierced his limbs, with nails of dark flesh protruding from both sides. On his right side, a wound opened similar to that which the centurion's spear had caused in Jesus Christ's body, from which blood frequently flowed, soaking his robe and trousers. These wounds were not simple external marks, but real wounds that caused him intense physical pain, especially when walking or moving his hands. St. Francis carefully concealed this extraordinary prodigy. Showing the wounds only to his confessors and some of the most trusted brothers, he considered that he had received such a special favor that it should be surrounded by the greatest possible secrecy, out of humility and to avoid vainglory. However, Brother Leo and other witnesses left written testimony of this miracle, which made St. Francis the first stigmatized person in the history of the Catholic Church. The stigmata remained on his body until his death, being a constant source of physical pain, but also of immense spiritual consolation, for they continually reminded him of the passion of his beloved Lord Jesus Christ. Chapter 9. The Canticle of the Creatures. During the last years of his life, while his body progressively weakened due to fasting, penances, and the sacred wounds, the spirit of St. Francis reached the highest peaks of mystical contemplation. In 1225, gravely ill and almost completely blind from an eye ailment contracted during his travels to the East, St. Francis of Assisi sought refuge in a small cell built next to the convent of St. Damian's, where St. Clare and her sisters cared for him with maternal devotion. It was precisely during this period of intense physical suffering that the most beautiful poetic composition in all of Italian religious literature blossomed from his soul, the Canticle of the Creatures. This extraordinary hymn was born during a night of intense pain when St. Francis experienced such profound spiritual consolation that it completely transformed his perception of suffering. In an inner vision, the Lord assured him that all his suffering would be counted as merits for eternal life, and that he should rejoice as if he already possessed the kingdom of heaven. This revelation filled his heart with such joy that, completely forgetting his ailments, he spontaneously began to compose verses of praise to God, manifested in all the creatures of the universe. The canticle reflects St. Francis's deeply contemplative spirituality, who had learned to see in every element of creation a manifestation of divine love and beauty. The sun, the moon, the stars, the wind, the water, the fire, and the earth were not for him mere material realities, but brothers and sisters who, each in their own way, sang the glories of the Creator. This fraternal vision of creation was rooted in St. Francis's mystical experience, who had understood that all creatures came from the same Heavenly Father and were called to form a single cosmic family. Under the universal fatherhood of God, the composition of the canticle developed in several stages. Initially, St. Francis sang the stanzas dedicated to the cosmic creatures: Brother Sun, Sister Moon, Brother Wind, and Sister Water. Later, he added the stanza about Sister Death when he felt his transition to the Father's house approaching. Between these two compositions, he inserted verses about forgiveness and reconciliation, motivated by a dispute that had arisen between the bishop and the podesta of Assisi, whom St. Francis wanted to exhort to peace through the singing of his poem. The Canticle of the Creatures transcends the merely literary dimension to become an authentic theological and mystical expression. It reflects the Franciscan understanding of the relationship between God, man, and creation, where all created realities are called to form a universal chorus of praise to the Creator. St. Francis not only contemplates the beauty of the creatures, but invites them to participate consciously in the cosmic liturgy of adoration to God. This composition exerted an extraordinary influence on the subsequent spiritual and literary tradition in Italy, becoming one of the masterpieces of universal religious literature and the foundational document of a new Christian sensibility towards creation. Chapter 10. The Final Days. In early 1226, Saint Francis's health deteriorated rapidly. The stigmata caused him constant pain, the eye disease had left him practically blind, and a stomach ailment prevented him from retaining food. However, his spirit remained serene and joyful, as if he were already tasting in advance the eternal happiness that awaited him. Aware that his transition to the Father's house was approaching, St. Francis expressed the desire to spend his last days in the Porziuncola, the place he considered the heart of his vocation and of the entire Franciscan order. During these final months, St. Francis dedicated himself to blessing all his spiritual children and to transmitting his last teachings. He dictated his spiritual testament, a moving document in which he summarized the fundamental graces he had received from God and exhorted the brothers to remain faithful to the ideal of evangelical poverty that had inspired the founding of the order. In this text, St. Francis recalled with emotion his first encounter with the lepers, a moment he considered the beginning of his conversion, and thanked the Most High for all the mercies received during his religious life. The last weeks were a continuous physical ordeal, but St. Francis lived them with a heroic patience that edified all those around him. He frequently asked them to sing the Canticle of the Creatures, especially the stanza dedicated to Sister Bodily Death, which he had learned to see not as an enemy, but as the gateway to true life. His supernatural joy contrasted so greatly with his bodily suffering that the brothers could not help but recognize in him a true saint who had already achieved perfect conformity with the divine will. On October 3rd, 1226, St. Francis asked to be completely stripped naked and placed on the bare earth, wanting to die as he had lived in perfect poverty, possessing absolutely nothing in this world, surrounded by his most beloved brothers, among whom were Brother Leo, Brother Angel, and Brother Maceo. He began to recite Psalm 141, "With my voice I cry to the Lord. With my voice I plead to the Lord." His breathing became weaker and weaker, but his face radiated a celestial peace that filled all those present with consolation. When the supreme moment of transition arrived, St. Francis spoke his last words, addressing Christ directly. "I have done what was mine to do. May Christ teach you what you must do." Then, with a beatific smile, he peacefully surrendered his soul to the Creator. Witnesses reported that at the moment of his death, a multitude of larks, birds that St. Francis had especially loved for their habit of singing at dawn, perched on the roof of the cell, launching melodious trills, as if all creation wanted to pay homage to the saint, who had known how to see in every creature a reflection of divine beauty. St. Francis died as he had lived, poor, humble, and totally abandoned in the hands of divine providence, but rich in those celestial riches that neither moth nor rust can corrode. Chapter 11. Canonization and Legacy. The news of St. Francis' death spread rapidly throughout Italy and Europe, causing an extraordinary commotion among the multitudes who had known and venerated him in life. His funeral, held on October 4th in Assisi, became an impressive popular demonstration, with the participation of representatives from all social classes and numerous ecclesiastical and civil authorities who came from distant regions to pay homage to the saint. The people of Assisi, who in Francis's youth had considered him a fool, now hailed him as their most illustrious son and a genuine treasure of Christianity. Testimonies about the miracles attributed to Francis's intercession began to multiply immediately after his death. The brothers of the Franciscan order following the provisions of canon law, carefully collected all these supernatural manifestations, along with testimonies about the heroic sanctity that Francis had demonstrated throughout his religious life, miraculous healings, apparitions of the deceased saint, and extraordinary prodigies that occurred before his tomb in St. George's Church, quickly convinced the ecclesiastical authorities that they were dealing with an exceptional case of holiness. Pope Gregory IX, who had known Francis personally when he was still Cardinal Hugh of Ostia, and had been a friend and protector of the Franciscan order, initiated the canonization process just 2 years after the saint's death. The testimonies collected during the process were so numerous and convincing that the pontiff had no doubt about Francis's heroic sanctity. On July 16, 1228, in a solemn ceremony held in St. George's Church in Assisi, Gregory IX officially proclaimed Francis of Assisi a saint, making him one of the most rapidly canonized saints in the history of the Catholic Church. The canonization of St. Francis coincided with the beginning of the construction of the grand basilica that bears his name in Assisi, an architectural work that would become one of the most important shrines in Christendom. Pope Gregory IX personally laid the first stone of the temple, which was conceived not only as the saint's tomb, but also as a center of pilgrimage and as a tangible symbol of the importance that the Catholic Church attached to the Franciscan charism. The basilica, with its magnificent frescoes created by the best artists of the time, became a perpetual testimony to how authentic holiness transcends the centuries and continues to inspire the highest expressions of art and Christian devotion. The spiritual legacy of St. Francis extended far beyond the Franciscan order he had founded. His example of evangelical poverty, his tender love for Christ crucified, his filial devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and his fraternal vision of all creation profoundly influenced later Catholic spirituality. Saints like St. Anthony of Padua, St. Bonaventure, Blessed John Duns Scotus, and St. Catherine of Siena drank from the fountain of Franciscan spirituality to develop their own charisms. Franciscanism became one of the most fruitful spiritual currents in Christianity, giving rise not only to numerous religious congregations, but also to a new Christian sensibility that knew how to harmoniously integrate mystical contemplation with charitable service towards the poorest and most needy. Chapter 12. Prayer to St. Francis of Assisi. O glorious St. Francis of Assisi, purest mirror of Christian holiness and faithful imitator of Jesus Christ, poor and crucified, we venerate you as the Father of all who seek evangelical perfection in the stripping away of earthly goods, and in ardent love towards God and towards their brothers and sisters, you who knew how to find in poverty the most precious treasure, and in suffering the source of the purest joy, intercede for us before the throne of the Most High, so that we may know how to detach ourselves from all that prevents us from walking with firm step towards holiness. Seraphic Father, you who received in your body the sacred wounds of the Redeemer as the supreme testimony of your love for the passion of Christ, help us to understand that true discipleship of the Lord necessarily passes through participation in his redemptive sufferings. Obtain for us the grace to embrace with patience and supernatural joy the crosses that divine providence places in our path, seeing in each pain an opportunity to become more perfectly like our crucified Savior. May your example teach us to transform each tear into a precious pearl to adorn the crown that we hope to receive in heaven. Most humble saint, you who always considered yourself the least of all the brothers and sisters and the greatest of sinners, obtain for me the virtue of true humility, which is the solid foundation upon which all other Christian virtues are built. Free our hearts from the mortal poison of pride and vainglory, and help us to recognize with sincerity our limitations and miseries, so that we may abundantly receive the divine grace that is only poured out upon humble and contrite hearts. May we rejoice when we are despised and forgotten by men, remembering that in this way we become like Christ, who being God, emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, universal brother of all creatures. You who knew how to discover in each element of creation a reflection of the beauty and infinite goodness of the Creator. Teach us to contemplate with clear eyes the wonders that God has placed around us. Help us to overcome the spiritual blindness that prevents us from recognizing the divine footprints imprinted in all creation, and grant us the grace to be good stewards of the gifts that we have received from providence. May your canticle of the creatures eternally resound in our hearts, reminding us that all creation is called to form a single chorus of praise to the thrice holy God. Amen.